Good morning, Team Alabama. We are ready for Anne Frank. Today we're on page 508. Mr. Dussel has just moved into the attic location with the Franks, and Anne is going to share her room with him, and she's kind of trying to tell him about that. 508 at the bottom in the first column. Anne, you stay here in the mornings, and then I'll take the room in the afternoon. Tell me, when you're here, what happens to me? Where am I spending my time? In there with all the people? Yes, I see. We have supper at 6:30. Dussel going over to the sofa. Then, if you don't mind, I'd like to lie down quietly for 10 minutes before eating. I find it helps the digestion. Okay, so let's write a fact about Mr. Dussel. Mr. Dussel seems to be a little like OCD or particular or finicky, or he kind of has some odd qualities about him. Okay, so write a fact that you know about Mr. Dussel. He's a dentist. He came to live with the Franks. Anne is going to share her room with him. Okay. Of course, I hope that I am not going to be too much of a bother to you. I seem to be able to get everybody's back up. Dussel lies down on the sofa, curled up, his back to her. I always get along very well with children. My patients all bring their children to me because they know that I get on well with them. So don't you worry about that. Anne leans over him, taking his hand and shaking it gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Dussel. The lights dim to darkness and the curtain falls on the scene, and Anne's voice comes to us faintly at first and then with increasing power. And yesterday I finished Sissy van Marksvelt's latest book. I think she is a first-class writer. I shall definitely let my children read her. Monday, the 21st of September, 1942. Mr. Dussel and I had another battle yesterday. Yes, Mr. Dussel. According to him, nothing, I repeat, nothing, is right about me. My appearance, my character, my manners. While he was going on at me, I thought, sometime I'll give you such a smack that you'll fly right up to the ceiling. Okay, write a fact about what Anne thinks of Mr. Dussel. Does she like him? Is their time going well? Okay, there are a couple of facts you can write about that. Why is it that every grown-up thinks that he knows the way to bring up children, particularly the grown-ups that never had any? I keep wishing that Peter was a girl instead of a boy, and then I would have someone to talk to. Margot's a darling, but she takes everything too seriously. To pause for a moment on the subject of Mrs. Van Daan, I must tell you that her attempts to flirt with Father are getting her nowhere. Pim, thank goodness, won't play. Remember, Pim is Anne's pet name for her dad, and Mrs. Van Daan is a flirt. She's kind of a hoochie mama. Okay, she kind of flirts very openly with Mr. Frank in front of Mrs. Frank. So those are all facts that you could write about what's going on in the attic. Okay, scene 4. In the middle of the night, several months later, the stage is dark except for a little light which comes through the skylight in Peter's room. Everyone is in bed. Mr. and Mrs. Frank lie on the couch in the main room, which has been pulled out to serve as a makeshift double bed. Margot is sleeping on a mattress on the floor in the main room, behind a curtain stretched across for privacy. The others are all in their accustomed rooms. And from outside we hear two drunken soldiers singing Lil Marlene. A girl's high giggle is heard, and the sound of running feet is heard coming closer and then fading in the distance. Throughout the scene there is a distant sound of airplanes passing overhead. A match suddenly flares up in the attic. We dimly see Mr. Van Daan. He is getting his bearings, and he comes quickly down the stairs and goes to the cupboard where the food is stored. Guys, what's he doing? Why is he in with the food? Again, the match flares up and is as quickly blown out. The dim figure is seen to steal back up the stairs. Okay, what's he doing? He's stealing their food. Okay? There is quiet for a second or two, and broken only by a sound of airplanes and running feet on the streets below. And suddenly, out of the silence and dark, we hear Anne scream. Anne screaming, "No! No! Don't take me!" She moans, tossing and crying in her sleep. The other people wake, terrified, and Dussel sits up in his bed, furious. Okay, she's having a nightmare. "Shush, Anne! Anne, for God's sake, shush!" Still in her dream, "Save me, save me!" She screams and screams, and Dussel gets out of bed, going over to her, trying to wake her. "For God's sakes, quiet, quiet! You want someone to hear you?" In the main room, Mrs. Frank grabs a shawl and pulls it around her. She rushes into Anne, taking her in her arms, and Mr. Frank hurriedly gets up, putting on his overcoat. Margot sits up, terrified. Peter's light goes on in his room. Mrs. Frank to Anne in her room. "Hush, darling, hush. It's all right, it's all right." Over her shoulder to Dussel. "Will you be kind enough to turn on the light, Mr. Dussel?" Back to Anne. "It's nothing, my darling. It was just a dream." Dussel turns on the light in the bedroom, and Mrs. Frank holds Anne in her arms. Gradually, Anne comes out of her nightmare, still trembling with horror. Mr. Frank comes into the room and goes quickly to the window, looking out to be sure that no one is outside has heard Anne's scream. Mrs. Frank holds Anne, talking softly to her, and in the main room, Margot stands on a chair, turning on the center hanging lamp. A light goes on in Mrs. Van Dan's room overhead. Peter puts on his robe and coming out of his room. Dussel to Mrs. Frank, blowing his nose. "Something must be done with that child, Mrs. Frank. Yelling like that, who knows but there's somebody on the street. She's endangering all our lives." So Mr. Dussel's kind of a jerk, okay? "Anne, darling, every night she twists and turns. I don't sleep. I spend half my night shushing her, and now it's nightmares." Margot comes to the door of Anne's room, followed by Peter. Mr. Frank goes to them, indicating that everything is all right. Peter takes Margot back. Mrs. Frank to Anne. "You're here, safe, you see. Nothing has happened to Dussel. Please, Mr. Dussel, go back to bed. She'll be herself in a minute or two, won't you, Anne?" Dussel, picking up a book and a pillow. "Thank you, but I'm going to the WC, the one place where there's peace." He stalks out. Mr. Van Dan is in underwear and trousers, comes down the stairs. Mr. Van Dan to Dussel. "What is it? What happened? A nightmare? She was having a nightmare? I thought someone was murdering her." "Unfortunately, no." He goes into the bathroom, and Mr. Van Dan goes back up the stairs, and Mr. Frank in the main room sends Peter back to his own room. "Thank you, Peter. Go back to bed." Peter goes back to his room, and Mr. Frank follows him, turning on the light and looking out the window. And then he goes back to the main room and gets up on the chair, turning on the center hanging light. Mrs. Frank to Anne. "Would you like some water?" Anne shakes her head. "Was it a very bad dream? Perhaps if you told me." "I'd rather not talk about it." "Poor darling. Try to sleep then. I'll sit right here beside you until you fall asleep." And she brings a stool over, sitting there. "You don't have to." "But I'd like to stay with you very much, really. I'd rather you didn't." So Anne tells her mom, "No, I don't really want you to stay with me. I don't want you." Okay, what's that relationship between Anne and mom? "Good night, then." She leans down to kiss Anne, and Anne throws her arm up over her face, turning away. Mrs. Frank, hiding her hurt, kisses Anne's arm. "You'll be all right. There's nothing that you want. Will you please ask Father to come?" So Anne asks Mom, "I don't want you, but I'd like Dad to come in here." So she's much closer to Dad and feels that relationship with Dad. Mrs. Frank, after a second, "Of course, Anne dear." She hurries out into the other room, and Mr. Frank comes to her as she comes in. And he says these words in German. "She's asking for you." Mr. Frank, "Edith." And he's like, "Darling, look, dear, look." And then she says all of this stuff in German. And basically she says, "It's all right. I thank dear God that at least she turns to you when she needs comfort. Go in, Otto. She is hysterical. She is hysterical with fear. She wants nothing of me. She pulled away when I leaned down to kiss her." Margot says to Mom, "It's a phase. You heard Father. Most girls go through it. They turn to their fathers at this age. They give all their love to their fathers. You weren't like this. You didn't shut me out. She'll get over it." She smooths the bed for Mrs. Frank and sits beside her for a moment as Mrs. Frank lies down in Anne's room. Mr. Frank comes in, sitting down by Anne, and Anne flings her arms around him, clinging to him. And in the distance, we hear the sounds of ack, ack. "Oh, Pim, I dreamed that they came to get us, the green police. They broke down the door and they grabbed me and they started to drag me out of the way that they did Jopie. I want you to take this pill." Dad says to Anne, "What is it?" "Something to quiet you." She takes it and drinks the water, and in the main room, Margot turns out the light and goes back to her bed. Mr. Frank to Anne, do you want me to read to you for a while? Okay, we're going to stop there for today. I'd like for you to add a few facts if you haven't already. We can add that Anne had a nightmare. Mom tries to comfort her. Anne doesn't really want Mom's comfort. Anne asks for Dad, and that hurts Mom's feelings. All of those are facts. Make them complete sentences. We can also add that Mr. Dussel was not very understanding of her nightmare. Mr. Dussel seems to be kind of annoyed by her, and he's not very kind to Anne. He treats her like a child that just annoys him. Okay? Okay, make sure you get a good 5 facts in there, or 10 today, and have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama.